Hello and welcome. My name is Sean Williams, and thank you for joining us once again for yet another one of our podcasts in the series of conversations between Campbellsville University senior seminar students. Today, we are talking about the ideological, cultural, and even maybe some of the political differences between the United States and Russia. I have joining me tonight three of our regular podcasters. From my right to my left, I have Marshall Steele. And then from our Campbellsville location, and from our Washington, D.C. location, I have joining us once again, Eli and Oksana. How are y'all doing this evening?
Great.
It is lovely to have you with me. So first of all, to get started, tonight's conversation is a little bit different from most of the others that we've had over the course of the season. Rather than talking about maybe a specific question, a policy question, we're really looking more at the differences between the United States and Russia philosophically, and then trying to figure out how those philosophical differences translate into some of or express themselves in the relationships between the two countries. For those of you who've maybe watched our Syrian podcast, we may be rehashing some of the old policy content, but trying to understand how culturally the differences between our countries might be informing how we approach conflict and politics. So with that being said, and with that introduction in order, first of all, I want to start off, if you check out our blogs on ce2018.weebly.com, the blogs begin with a discussion of religion between the two countries. Certainly anybody who's from the United States know that compared to most Western European democracies, religion is particularly important to us. It's also very important to Russia. So to start out, what are some of the key religious differences between the United States and Russia? And then once we figure that out, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how maybe that plays a role in politics. So who wants to start off?
I can start off. One of the major differences is that Russia has actually adopted the Orthodoxy religion as the religion for the state, you could say. And in America, although we may have a religion that's more favorable, we have chosen to have sort of a separation of church and state, and we don't adopt a particular religion.
And I think, like, if we want to go a little historical into, like, looking at the role that it plays, of course, we know that in the United States, since the founding, we've had what we call freedom of religion. It's in our Bill of Rights in the First Amendment. And so, but then we look at Russia, on the other hand, and of course, we're going to go back and forth. Something important to note tonight is we're going to go back and forth between, at some points, calling it Russia, which is what it is today, and then sometimes referencing the Soviet Union, which are not the same thing, but a lot of times they are very similar, and they encompass like the same geographic area many times. But so the Soviet Union was obviously during the 1900s, whereas today it's Russia. So one of the most important, like, historical things to look at is how, like she was talking about, how the Russian Orthodox Church is like the official religion of is the official church of Russia, is to look at how it was before the Soviet Union, how it played a huge role in their politics and had a huge role in their government. But then during the Soviet Union, of course, they tried to get rid of all religion through multiple ways of, like, not literally brainwashing, but in a way brainwashing all their people of what religion was. So then when the Soviet Union collapses, of course, there's some sort of, like, I guess you could call it a religious vacuum to fill. And so the Russian Orthodox Church, of course, wants to fill that. But the problem is that now that they're a free country, well, after they break from the Soviet Union, all these missionaries from other countries see that this is now an opportunity, now that religion is allowed, to come in and start sharing their religion. But obviously the Russian Orthodox Church was not happy about that because they wanted to return to power. And so that kind of sets up why they play a huge role in it today.
Yeah, for the people at home who maybe aren't quite as familiar, can you kind of just speak a little bit about the difference between Orthodoxy and Catholicism? I mean, obviously the split between the two religions happened well over 1,000 years ago. But just a couple of key distinctions between the two. Does somebody want to take a shot at that?
Mhm.
So there are a couple of ideological and pragmatic differences between the two. One of the biggest differences is that whereas the Catholic Church is hierarchical in nature, and with a hierarchy led by a single individual, the Bishop of Rome, who is called the Pope, the Orthodox Church is a little bit more decentralized. So they have patriarchs who serve in the same role as bishops. And there is a highest ranking patriarch, but there isn't exactly that same kind of authority. It's more similar to what we might see in the Anglican Communion, where there's an Archbishop of Canterbury who is the highest ranking Anglican priest, but is not considered to be authoritative in the same way that the Pope is considered to be authoritative. So if we think about this in context, and keep in mind what Eli had said about this relationship between the Orthodox Church and the Russian government, what are some of the ways that we're seeing, either historically or today, that the state is trying to use the Orthodox Church? And then do we see similar parallels in the United States with how the state attempts to use religion?
Well, there's definitely been it in researching this. It reminds me considerably of the Roman Catholic Church of a millennia ago, 2 millennia ago, that religion bolstered the state and the state bolstered the religion, or the state supported religion and religion gave legitimacy to the state. We see that a lot in this relationship between the Orthodox Church and the Russian government. Of course, in modern times, the government has spent billions of dollars of state-owned energy company money to either build or rebuild somewhere around 25,000 Orthodox churches in Russia. And then in less monetary ways, if you can go back to the USSR in World War II, which was, as Eli mentioned earlier, very tried to constrain religion and open religiosity during their rule. But during World War II, they relaxed citizens' ability to openly practice their religion if they were Christian or Jewish, because that helped encourage people to join the cause and fight for Russia during the war. So there are instances where both the state has used religion, like supporting it that way, or in this way of using it as a legitimacy crutch. I guess you could say that so long as the money is moving to the Orthodox Church, they will speak highly and praiseworthy of the state. Whereas in contrast to the United States, those things are very separate. Of course, the majority of the money that churches raise in the United States comes from donations, their own sourcing of money, and it's not primarily government money that goes to that. And we hear all the time senatorial, presidential invocations of faith, but never an outright indication that this church or this sect of Christianity is the predominant or the state-sponsored religion. So and there are plenty of organizations like the Freedom from Religion Foundation that are working to constantly keep that relationship in check, such that the United States won't be tempted to fall in the same kind of loop that the Russian government's in right now.
Yeah, I agree with Marshall. I think that we see sort of in Russia that having a state church sort of helps control the culture. And as he said, as long as everything's going good, then the church talks highly of the government and such. And so more so than I think in America, our culture being, because of our religion there, the religion impacts the culture and sort of controls that. And like we see, the first thing to go for a country is freedom of religion. And that's sort of, for me, the basis that I put off, and I think a lot of people put off, is that if a country doesn't have freedom of religion, then they're more than likely not necessarily free.
Are there a couple of examples of policies that are currently important in Russia that you can see that there's this clear corollary between the Russian Orthodox Church is championing a cause or policy position, the government is delivering on that, and then in exchange, the church is maybe helping the government or elected officials in some way? Are there a couple of policies that we've seen in the last few years?
Yeah, in 1997 it was. So how I was talking earlier about how when the Russian Orthodox Church was trying to fill that religious vacuum, so when all those other religions were coming in to try to evangelize and to convert people to their religion now that they could past the Soviet Union, so that upset the Russian Orthodox Church, of course, and so they convinced the state to pass a law in 1997 that restricted freedom of religious practice of faiths that were considered foreign, and that's the exact word that they use, in origin. That way, that could make the Russian Orthodox Church be like the main religion for the state. And then, of course, they've had, like right now, I know for sure, the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the head of the Russian Orthodox Church work very closely together. They're like very good friends and allies. And that's to promote policy and to, like Oksana was talking about, shaping the culture, because that plays a huge role, especially in what we think of as the Russian nation, like just promoting nationalism through their religion.
Yeah, another great example, what I like about that, the 1997 law, and then this one I'm about to touch on that was passed in 2006, is so far the government is not making any overt statement of national church or a national religion, but they are, like, these kind of laws are pretty overtly bending that in favor of the Orthodox Church. In 2006, they passed the law on public associations, and what it did was created a lot of provisions that these religious organizations had to meet, reporting a wide variety of things to the Russian government, or else they could risk closure and disbandment by the government. So those the kind of provisions that are in that 2006 law are very easily met by a huge religious organization like the Orthodox Church, but very small Protestant sects within the country, any kind of other, as the 1997 law states, foreign religions had a lot harder time complying with those provisions. So the Russian government is operating on the idea of sort of ability for other religions to practice without saying that they don't want them to.
Yeah, I like that he pointed out that it's not an official state, like they don't say that that's their state religion, but it's literally everything except for labeling it. Like they promote it literally through their law and through their public policy, yet it's not considered the official state religion. So that's important to know, that like anytime we call it the state religion, it's not officially it, but in practice it is.
Would you say that somehow similar to the way that Christianity ranks in the United States, that in fact our First Amendment of the Constitution says we cannot have an established religion? Our courts have said we cannot endorse religion, but certainly Christianity has had a favored status among our politicians and our politics. Is there a parallel there, or am I pushing that too far?
I definitely think it's interesting that in our Constitution, we have separation of church and state, but we also have in our Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. And I think right there, you almost have to think about, did they specifically call us like make the state, separation of church and state, and then one nation under God, and differentiating between a state and a nation intentionally there, saying that the nation, which is built on a similar foundation of beliefs, versus a state, which is a body that's governed. So it makes me just curious. I don't know how you could necessarily prove that, but it definitely brings that line of thinking in the differentiation between the words state and nation that are both used in like the Constitution and the Pledge of Allegiance.
I think it's also interesting with us having freedom of religion and freedom of speech that, yes, we're not supposed to necessarily have a state religion or a national religion, but because we have the freedom to speak freely and because we have the freedom to believe what we want to believe, lawmakers and such can still express their opinions without retribution. So Kentucky may not have Christianity as its state religion, but that can't stop our governor from expressing his own views about it, and in a sense, making it seem as though possibly one state has a religion based off of what their group full of lawmakers choose to say and choose to pray and choose to partake in and highlight, however they'd like to highlight it.
In the U.S., when we think about the relationship between church and state, or between, as Oksana pointed out, between politicians and faith, we tend to think of the religion as having a more conservative social influence. I think of a few issues like gay marriage or homosexuality in general, where religious forces have had the influence of trying to slow down or stop social change. Is the same thing true in Russia? Would the Orthodox Church's relationship with the Russian government be one of a conservative influence, or is it different somehow?
I think if you want to use the very like definition of conservative as like conserving ideals, then absolutely, like having the church there, like we've been talking about, how it's to, I guess, even though you're creating a new culture, you're still preserving what is there. And it's almost in a way like not letting outside influence come in. So in that way, I would absolutely define the Russian Orthodox Church as a conservative force for the Russian government in conserving their ideals, whatever they may be, because I mean, I guess they could change, especially in such a dynamic country as going from the Soviet Union to Russia. But I definitely would define that as conservative if you're going to go with the traditional use of the word.
I agree with Eli. I think by, acting to not have outside forces, then, and using the definition of conservatism, then yeah, that is what that would be.
We're going to make a bit of a hard transition here. So we've talked a little bit about this, the relationship between religion, church, and state. We can't really have a conversation about the United States and Russia without talking about foreign policy. And so let's specifically come back to a topic we've discussed in a previous broadcast, the topic of Syria and America and Russia's disparate role in the region. For viewers who might not have watched that video or who may not remember the origin story of the Syrian conflict, how did the United States and Russia both originally get involved in Syria, so that we can then talk about how they interact with one another in the region?
So the Syrian conflict itself really outbroke in 2011. The United States didn't enter the conflict until the Assad regime was overtly using chemical weapons. And then we still haven't entered in a full-scale military capacity like we've seen with Afghanistan or Iraq. And in that same sense, Russia has done the same. They didn't enter until September of 2015, and still that entrance has been in airstrikes, which Russia claims to be against ISIS. International watchdogs have reported that that's predominantly been on civilians in Syria, not on any hard military targets. But yeah, the two of them have been in the conflict for 3 to 4, just neither of them in a capacity other than what seems to be suiting their interests. their geopolitical interests rather than actually trying to resolve the Syrian conflict.
I think, yeah, that's really important to note, like the geopolitical interests that they have. And also when you said that the US didn't they're still not officially joined. And I think that's kind of the biggest issue here. And one of the things to note is that the Syrian civil war, even though now it's considered a proxy war, is not one side versus the other. There have been multiple different actors. And so that's played a role in how these countries have defined what their role is there. For example, when the Russians go, they said they were coming to defeat ISIS. And that's exactly what the US said their involvement was to defeat ISIS. But you see, that's where they both come in with saying that they're going in for the same reason. But then you see the US also sending in troops to train Syrian rebels, because that's on the pro-democracy side with the whole Arab Spring, the people that are fighting for democracy in their country. But you also see the Russians, bombing, when they say they're bombing the Islamic State, you also see that they actually targeted a side that was very close to the rebel side so they could specifically help the Assad regime. And what you come down to there is a power vacuum that they're both trying to fill, because they know after a civil war ends, there's always a power vacuum, or an influence vacuum at least, and obviously we're fighting for Western influence and Russian influence, and that whoever is on the winning side of the war thinks that they're going to get the main part of the influence there. So I think that's plays a huge role, as the U.S. wants to democratize the Middle East. But Russia also wants to expand its empire. So they both have their own interests, even though they both say they're there to defeat ISIS.
I agree with both of them. I think they pretty much covered it.
So to hear the way that you're discussing it, you're making it sound as if the two sides, while they both want to have influence in the region, if I understood you correctly, Eli, what you'd said was that the Russians are trying to establish or reestablish their empire, but the Americans are trying to spread or expand democracy. Do you think it's as clear as that we have two different foreign policy objectives? The Americans in the West are trying to create more democratic countries, whereas the Russians are trying to create more loyal allies in the region? Or do you think it's just simply realpolitik here? The Americans want control, the Russians want control, and they're willing to fight it out through another party in order to achieve it.
I think you got it.
That's the bottom line. And yeah, there's obviously some still major geopolitical victories that either side would gain. If Assad remains in power, then Russia keeps an ally that is on Israel's doorstep. If America can find a way to usurp Assad and install some democratic regime, they are on Iran's doorstep. And further, they are, it's expanding that almost Cold War-esque sphere of control around the Iron Curtain. But yeah, I think at the base of things, it's about that same two-power contingency between the two for some sort of world domination, world hegemonic control. And Syria just happens to be the best place for them to hash that out.
Yeah, I don't think anything that we as Americans or Russians as Russians do are ever very clear cut. And like Eli and Marshall pointed out, we've disguised it with that we're both defeating ISIS, like we want to defeat ISIS. But obviously when one side is saying, hey, yeah, I'm going to defeat ISIS, and they're helping the rebels, and the other side is saying, hey, yeah, I'm going to defeat ISIS, but I'm helping the Assad regime, that clearly comes down to whether we want to help defeat ISIS and Americanize, or we want to help defeat ISIS and Russianize the situation. And so I don't think anything's ever clear cut, and we're definitely not there to just defeat ISIS.
Right. And I like that Marshall pointed out that this also involves the whole Israel. When I was talking about the democratization of the Middle East, obviously we talk about how Israel is the only strong democracy in the Middle East. And so this could be seen as the US's next power grab for democracy. But I think that goes to show exactly what the motive is here. Like, it's so much bigger than just the US and Russia fighting in Syria. I mean, like, some people consider what the US and Russia are doing now to be a whole nother Cold War situation. And that's because you see they're just fighting for dominance all across the world. It's who's going to have influence here. And then you could even get into the whole topic of not even the US and Russia, even though that's what this podcast is about. You could include China in there and their whole new initiatives in Africa, and just who is going to be the next big power in the unipolar world we live in.
When we think about this conflict in Syria, where the Americans are engaging in live fire combat, they're attacking ISIS, the Assad regime in certain circumstances. For example, when the Assad regime have used chemical weapons, certain rebel groups. The Russians are doing the same thing. They're attacking different pro-American rebel groups. How are the Americans and Russians not killing each other at this point? How have they been managing to keep their two forces separate so that they haven't themselves been drawn into a shooting war between two great world superpowers?
Lots of communication.
Well, yeah, you go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, you take it, Marshall. You're good. It's on you.
Oh, okay. I was going to say that I was going to echo what Oksana said, lots of communication, but conflict has not gone without some connection between the two. Of course, in the conflict thus far, States has dropped bombs directly on what is what's commonly referred to as shadow military, which is like a bot or military group that takes orders, not the Kremlin's military. But the United States has killed mercenaries from that group, and in a reversal of that, the United States has been attacked, has been fired upon, as the Kremlin describes, on accident or without their knowledge, but nonetheless has taken fire from the same group. So it seems like there are some tit for tat instances in this, but when it comes to major military campaigns like the 2015 airstrikes from the Russian government, they gave a 1-hour warning to the United States government, which you can assume it is only good for so much. But the United States has repaid them with similar warnings, like when just prior to Trump's usage of the Tomahawk missiles in Syria, both the Russian government and the Syrian government were notified that the strike was going to occur prior to its occurrence. So there were a lot of Russian planes stationed at that airstrip that, as far as I understand, were not there by the time those missiles impacted. So it's that kind of semi-open dialogue that they like to keep flowing, so that we don't get into some crazy political situation that you can't escape from based on some accident.
Given where we are at the conflict now, and again, this is a question that we had discussed in our other podcast, but do you believe there is a chance that the Americans and the Russians can reach some kind of an agreement? Or maybe more to the point, is there a chance that the Americans and the Assad regime can reach some kind of an agreement to end the war? Or does it feel like this war is basically going to end on its own, whether the Americans agree to it or not?
No, I definitely think, like Marshall was saying, we've kind of been noting this the whole time, is that with the influence war, like it's honestly going to be a new case, I want to say, that you can't really take examples from past history, because just this situation with the U.S. saying this is like a new democracy to have, or a place to put their power. and Russia doing the same exact thing, even though some would say that could obviously be correlated to like with the Cold War times. I just think this is just so different with where Syria is located in the Middle East. I'm not really sure what the U.S. if Syria ends up winning, because that's obviously what it looks like right now. If the Syrian government and the Russian government supported side wins this, then obviously Russia will have a much bigger influence than the U.S. And the U.S. is going to have to decide, well, are we going to keep fighting for our own influence even though they've won the war, or are we going to take a step back and realize that we lost this? And that's going to be up to policymakers, our foreign policy heads, to decide what is the best choice for America.
Now, the Syrian conflict is obviously including the United States and Russia, but it is not operating in a vacuum. A few days or maybe a week before this taping, it was announced that the United States, under the Trump administration, has decided to remove the United States from a nuclear arms agreement, which had originally been negotiated several decades ago. Specifically, it was a ban on mid-range nuclear weapons, the sort of nuclear weapons that would be used in a conflict in the European theater. Do you feel that these actions, that the conflict in Syria, that the efforts on the Trump administration to renuclearize or start another nuclear arms race, do you feel that this is suggesting that we may be moving towards either another Cold War, a second Cold War, or even the possibility of a broader conflict between America and Russia?
I sure hope not. But yeah, that's so hard to tell, especially since this news is so fresh. I would optimistically think that a second nuclear arms race is not likely, just because the incentive to amass a huge nuclear weapons arsenal is not the playing field isn't the same as it was in the 70s and 80s, the 60s. And, you know, the United States already has a huge collection of nuclear weapons. So does the Soviet Union. And they've been slowly weaning that back since that agreement has been signed. But, you know, the amount of military power that both countries have, I think, is something that doesn't require them to rebuild that arsenal. But I think of this kind of removal from our previous agreement is a political move that I think does echo the sort of sentiments that you're discussing of a resurgence of bad attitudes towards the two countries in their relations. You know, I don't know that we'll get back to some sort of arms race, but it's definitely unnerving that because these sort of political moves are typically the kind that you see start to stack up before something large and cumulative happens. There's a lot of political discussions and negotiations that are torn up, and this is sort of like that canary in the coal mine kind of thing. Yeah.
I think it's almost like you have to look at that whole Trump withdrawing from that nuclear agreement. You can choose to look at it from an idealistic or a realistic standpoint. I feel like personally, I feel like if you want to take an idealistic standpoint on it, then you're thinking along the lines of, okay, he's doing something that seems kind of crazy. Give it 2 more years while he's in office, and then maybe that'll be the next president will sign back on. Or you can take the realist approach and say, like, that's what he did, that's what he meant, that's how we're doing it. And so I guess it's just how the people are going to view that. But it's also very interesting because, you know, people are sitting here saying, like, Trump is, you know, in bed with Russia and him and Putin are best friends. He treats him like, you know, like he's our strongest ally. But then, you know, he goes and gets rid of an agreement that past presidents who didn't even like Putin as much as Trump did, they stayed in it. So it's a very interesting, like, I guess it's just how you choose to look at it from which viewpoint.
another thing that we have to talk about if we want to consider American-Russian relations, and this specifically speaks to the point that you're making about the Trump and Putin relationship, is the allegations of meddling in American elections by Russian operatives, maybe under the orders of Vladimir Putin or maybe as rogue elements within their civil state. Do you feel that this is an issue that has died off or is no longer something that we need to be concerned about? Or in our upcoming elections, we're about exactly 1 week away from our November 6th election at the time of this taping. Do you feel that election meddling is still a present concern?
Well, there's several questions to answer in that. I'll start with has the entire uproar about the contention of meddling, has that died down, or is that no longer a real political issue? I would say that it has died down simply because we're not gaining information about it on a daily basis. We've heard about all the Mueller indictments and plea deals, but we don't have a concrete answer from the investigation. And so far as I know, I would hope that Bob Mueller is bipartisan enough or nonpartisan enough that we won't hear about this before the 6th. But anyway, I think that it will churn back up when more information is let out. But as a cultural issue, more of a social issue of our society, I think you're right. I think it's died down a bit. I think among a certain, I think no matter the results, some people won't have their minds changed, and people won't be interested in the true outcome of that really changing our system. But and as it refers to the midterms with this election cycle and the meddling, I'm definitely concerned. I don't know that the American populace as a whole, they may not be that informed as to the attempts that have already been overtly made, both now by the Russian government and by the Chinese government. We're learning more every day about money and other social media tricks, just like were implemented in 2016. But I think you saying it's not that much of is it that much of an issue? Yeah, I don't know that it really matters if it doesn't affect the general population's opinion.
Yeah, I think definitely, like, if you're going to sit here and talk about what the average American thinks, like, first of all, this year is not a presidential election. So we know from history that a lot of people don't even come out and vote on these years, not as many people. And so obviously it's not as big as a headline, so obviously people think it's a way bigger deal when they infringe on a presidential election, the head of our state, head of our government, versus a few congressional or Senate races. But what people don't realize is the whole concept here is that they are literally meddling in our elections. Like, it doesn't matter if that was literally for a city councilman or for the president of the United States. Like, the fact that Russia can still meddle in our elections is kind of terrifying. But then also, I think it's important to note that for those that are so against it and that sit here and talk about how they're infringing on our sovereignty, they also need to think about all the times that the U.S. has infringed on foreign elections, like, no matter the country. Just because we're a stronger country than someone else, if you're going to claim that we have sovereignty, well, then they should too. And so it's kind of an iffy subject, I guess, to talk about, because the same people that seem frustrated about one aren't frustrated about the other.
I think that, I agree with both of them, but also I think the American who's aware that someone interfered with our election is the same American who's probably aware that it wasn't the first time that it had happened and that it won't be the last time, and is also the same American that's aware that we've done our fair share of meddling in other people's elections. So for me, I feel like both of them have pointed out it's sort of something that's going to go under the radar, even if it is proven, because I think many people think if it wasn't Russia who's meddling in our elections, that somebody's listening to them on phone and somebody's listening to their elections and interfering with that. So at this point, invasion of privacy and election meddling is just another thing to add to the list that we have to get used to.
So we're almost out of time. This has actually been a relatively quick podcast. It seems like we've only gone through about half of the questions we'd scheduled to. But in the last 3 or 4 minutes, I just want to kind of go around the screen and ask you guys, in your opinion, do you feel that we are currently at a low point in Russian-American relations, that basically we kind of getting ready to turn this corner? Or in your opinion, do you think that we've now entered into this downward spiral, and that over the next 2 years prior to the next election, conditions will probably actually get worse between the two countries? Marshall, you go ahead and take that one first.
Sure. Well, that's an interesting question, because we, in the midst of the 2016 election and the Syrian civil war, the relationship between the United States politically and with Russia seems to be not descending. It's, you know, it's hard to measure how this is playing out, but it comes across as Trump's buddying up with Putin, whether that's just in words or in actual practice. You know, it's not been that long, but if we think back to the Obama era, the relationship between President Obama and Vladimir Putin was not a friendly one, and the outlook of a Clinton nomination, a Clinton presidency, was even worse. You know, people considered Clinton to be a huge hawk for Russia on foreign policy. So I don't know that the Trump administration is actively fixing ideological or political issues between the two countries, but it comes across that they aren't devolving. They're at least riding smooth at the moment.
I agree with Marshall. I don't think that anything substantial, whether it's negatively or positively, is going to happen with the U.S. and Russia, at least for the next 2 years. I think that, like he said, it's just going to continue to rot out whatever it's rotting out. And some days we might argue with them. But I think just as soon as we argue with them, we're going to be right back as friends with them. And I don't personally see anything wowing or substantial happening between us and Russia, at least for the next 2 years.
Eli, you get the final word.
Oh gosh, I think I'm going to take the unpopular opinion here and actually argue that I think Russian relations could actually worsen within the next 5 years, because I think it's also important to note that, of course, we've spent a lot of time talking about Syria here, but that's also not like the only issue area. And I don't think regardless of who wins in Syria and which of our countries gets to, I guess, take more power or influence over there, I still think there's just so many more places that there's just that fight between Russia/East versus the West in the United States. And so I definitely think that relations, of course, like it does depend on who is in power in the U.S. in 2 years and in 6 years. And whether or not there's more election meddling, because of course it's dying, like we were talking about, it's dying down now, the discussion about it. But if it is proven that that happened in the 2018 elections, or say in the 2020 presidential elections, I'm hopeful that the people of the United States won't be so quick to push it away like they have been with the 2016 election. So I actually think they could worsen within the next 5 years.
And speaking of the 2018 election, this is, I believe, the 7th or 8th in our series of podcasts. On our next podcast, we'll be just doing something a little bit different. We will be broadcasting live on Tuesday night following the midterm elections, talking about results and outlooks, and hoping to be able to make some important calls about key races in the Senate, as well as perhaps even have a sense of whether or not the Democrats are going to take the House of Representatives, or the Republicans are going to manage to keep a hold of it. And also a little bit of maybe a chat about what's going to be happening here in Kentucky in statewide races. So we hope that you join in for that. And until then, thank you very much for being with us. My name is Sean Williams, and have a good night.